Thank you. Thank you very much. Is this on? Yeah. Well, it's great to be here, and I appreciate the invitation. I appreciate the sponsors. I appreciate the elected officials being here. I hope I can provide a little enlightenment into how the home builders and the industry feels about housing and how we feel about participating as part of the local economy, particularly the Portland metropolitan economy. I'm going to show you some charts and some graphs and some tables. You know, economists are pretty much just like accountants without the personality. So, you know, an outgoing economist is somebody that looks at your shoes, not his. And that's as funny as it gets. So what the NAHB has had a local economic impact model for almost 20 years now. This was something we developed in coordination with local associations like Portland to bring home the point that housing has a local economic impact. Now that makes a lot of sense to you, and you can understand that whether you are in the industry or you see the industry working, but nobody really knows exactly how big that is. So our challenge was to come up with not only a system for evaluating what that was, highlighting how it really does impact the local economy, but then coming up with real numbers. And so we developed this model to show what the income, the taxes, and the jobs were when you build new homes in a community. But of course that means you also have to supply the fiscal services to that in those new homes. So there is an equivalent model that says, okay, if you build 100 houses, how much is that going to cost you to supply the infrastructure, to supply the teachers and the policemen and the EMS and all other things that you need when you get new homes? So this is a balanced model in which there's both what comes in as a result of the construction and the occupancy, and what goes out as part of supporting that, and where is the net. We in the home building industry believe that housing pays for itself. But it's up to us to try to convince other people of that fact. So that's where this comes from. And the whole assumption behind this model is one very, very simple one. What happens if that house is built in Portland instead of Seattle or Medford or Sacramento or wherever? So there is a difference if you get that house here. We're not saying that you suddenly have generated a whole new household. All we're saying is that household, or aggregately, that growth in your population has the option of staying here or moving away, and likewise the option of people moving here or moving somewhere else. So the whole point behind this is what happens if that household locates here instead of somewhere else. And the reason I make that distinction is because it's pretty easy to see the first impact of home building, and that's the impact that comes from actual construction. People out on the job working. What does that mean? They get money, they get paid, and they use that money locally. So there's a real economic impact. Somebody saved up their money or borrowed their money through a mortgage and is buying that home and spreading that economic wealth throughout the community. But that's not where it stops, because then you have those individuals who've worked on that property spend their money locally, but more importantly, for a very long period of time, you've got that new household in your community that's spending money locally. So that, if you fix that in your mind, it's a lot easier to understand the rest of what I've got to present. That's why we've done that. We've done this for more than 700 communities or states. In some cases, we've done an entire state. What's the economic impact of home building in an entire state? I had it peer-reviewed by other economists, had in some cases cooperated with other local universities and colleges in presenting it, in reviewing it. So I want to give you some confidence. There's a lot of additional validation information in the actual report, but this isn't something we feel is one-sided. We feel we've tried to do a fair job of representing what happens when you build a house. It is research, so in some sense, if we really knew what we were doing, we wouldn't have to do this. But we need the research, we need the numbers, we need the validation this really happens. So we look at all the benefits, all the possible new economic flows that come into a community because the house is here, as well as all the extra costs that come in because of the fact that you are burdening the local community with new demands on the infrastructure. We put it in 3 phases to try to get more at this reasoning behind it. So yes, the first phase is the fact that you have money spent because workers are working, lumber yards are selling, attorneys are closing, builders are paying their staff. So there's a lot of economic activity going on in just the bare construction of this house. But that doesn't stop there. Those new incomes create more jobs. Then the people that run the lumber yard hire additional people, and they spend their income locally. Not all of it. Some of their money goes to, if you buy a truck, the truck isn't made in Portland, but the dealer is in Portland, and the overhead and the profit that goes to the dealer remains here in the community. More logical things like workers that earn their living and then go out and eat out in a restaurant, buy local newspapers, get their laundry done, buy gasoline at the local gas station. You know, you could go on and on and on with this sense of retail operations that are enhanced because you've got new money flowing into those workers. And then the third phase is this occupancy phase that I mentioned before. If you didn't build that house, you wouldn't have that household. They wouldn't live in this community. But because they live in this community, they're spending some of their income in this community. They're going out to eat. They're buying gasoline. They're buying landscaping services. They're buying haircuts. They're buying anything that you could imagine that is more locally centered, locally owned, locally captured in people's pockets that live here. So that's the rough idea of this. You've often heard about housing equals jobs, meaning usually the equation, this is in the mathematics terms, that's an equation that goes both ways. So the normal way of saying things is that jobs or housing is where jobs go at night. So you need jobs in order to have, you need houses in order to have jobs in the community. In order to grow your community, in order to have more employment in your community, you need some place for those people to live. That's kind of the tradition we've placed the housing industry on, is the necessary component of expanding the job market. But it works the other way around too. You do get job generation by building houses, not only during the construction period, but also during the occupancy period, because these are new households that occupy the economic climate of the community. To give you a sense for the flow of this, this gets more into the technical nature of it, but basically we take, we use what we call an input-output model. Now, I don't want to go further unless somebody has a question on that, when I'll be glad to answer that. But essentially, the backbone of this overall economic model is taken from something that the U.S. government uses. Now, I don't want to diminish its value by mentioning the U.S. government, but they do some excellent work. And so the government tries to estimate the overall economic activity of the country, and that's done through something called an input-output model, meaning we know inputs flow into the businesses of your community, and out of that come outputs. People buy raw products, make something out of it, or they buy from the wholesaler and put it in their retail outlet, and that comes out to be somebody buying that. That's the root structure of this model. It comes from a technique and a methodology that is used principally throughout the rest of the government and throughout the rest of the business world. What we did was add the housing component to it. No other input-output model had the detail of housing construction that we did. So you essentially say, we're going to spend some money in the community building a house, and we know all the components that go into housing. We're going to put that into this input-output model, and it's going to tell us how many jobs, how much taxes, and how much income is going to flow into the community from that effort. The ripple effect is the continuation of that. If we have that many jobs earning that much income, we know that about 40% of that income is spent locally. That's just a general information we know from, again, other federal government information about consumption. People's consumption behavior, the amount of money they spend on locally produced goods versus the amount of money they spend on things that you can get either through the internet or that are effectively not necessarily manufactured in any one specific community. So we take out all of those. So even in cases where Portland may be the source for that ultimate production, we take that out because we can't be sure it's true in every single community. So we don't count the production of appliances. We only count the sale of the appliances through the retailer. We don't count, as I mentioned, automobiles. Anything that's a large-scale production that wouldn't necessarily be in every community is not counted. Another way of saying all that is we lean towards the conservative side of what we count towards a total economic activity in the community. Again, coming from the home builders, not a surprise, we're sometimes accused of perhaps being a bit biased towards home building. So in every case where there's a potential for there to be a debate over which way you would go, we've chosen to go to the conservative side. So I would suggest that these are minimums of economic impact. But the ripple effect is just that. It's because you introduce new income, new workers, or at least workers that are now earning an income, are going to spend about 40% of that income locally, and that generates more activity. So it continues to have, the classic visual of a stone thrown into the water has a significant amount of ripple, not beyond just the first effect. And then that occupancy phase is basically the same concept, except now we're dependent upon the income of the person that moved into that house, that bought that house. They have an income from somewhere. That's not important. They have a job. That's why they live in this community. And some of their income is then used throughout the community to purchase things. It means that this also creates new tax revenue to the local community. So it's not just the real estate taxes that you would expect to see as the flow of new revenue from a new household living there. But it's also the fact that as businesses expand, they're going to pay new taxes to the whatever municipality they're in. And as people's incomes expand, some of that income comes back. Sales tax, although usually almost always a state revenue, but to the extent that there's local add-ons, those are added in as well. So you get that same ripple effect. Those also create jobs that create more spending. And so you have this, once again, the sort of ongoing continuous effect from people living in the house. We do it for a metropolitan area. So although we are taking the underlying assumptions about what kind of house it is from the Portland side of the river of the state, technically speaking, metropolitan areas are defined by the federal government as economic entities. That's the reason you call a metropolitan statistical area what you call it, is that there's enough interaction between those counties to be considered one whole market. So this is what the Portland metropolitan area extends, of course, into some parts of southern Washington state. But this is the technically called, because those are the principal metropolitan areas within the whole statistical area. We start with this. This is information we get from the Home Builders Association, same as we would do it if we were doing any other model for any other location. So we start with an average house price of about $300,000, raw lot of a little over $37,000. That's taken out of the model, okay? So the land value is not a new economic activity. It's already there. That money that was paid for that land may have gone to a local, but that's not considered a new economic activity. It's land that would have been there regardless of what you do to it. So that's eliminated from any kind of activity. We get, as an average across the whole metropolitan area, about a $32,000 plus in permits and infrastructure fees, and then an annual property tax of about $4,500 on that particular house. And so we run these individual characteristics through our impact model. Now, there's a lot of other elementary information that's already imposed into that model for the Portland metropolitan area. Those pieces that I asked for on the previous slide are the ones that aren't readily available from other sources. But we get things like, what are the tax rates, what are the consumption patterns of individuals in Portland, what is the economic base of Portland. All of that stuff comes from other government sources. So we try to keep to a minimum the amount of information that has to come from individuals. And we run these models through these individual sequences. The first level of impact, therefore, is $13 million in local income, $3.7 million in new local taxes, and about 189 jobs. Now, what I mean by jobs is an entire year's worth of work for 189 people. Sometimes it's twice as many people for half as much time, but that's the way an economist does in a job equivalent, is how many equivalents of a whole year. Another interesting factor is that it's not all in construction. That's the most obvious one, that there's a lot of people out working on the construction site that are visible, but you have a lot of other hidden job creations. As I mentioned, you have the people that sell all the products, you have the people that delivered the products, you have the professionals that designed the house, that obtained the mortgage, that searched the title. All of these additional activities are part of an economic goose that you get when you build, in this case, 100 single-family homes. And the ripple is this notion that you continue to see economic activity bloom because people now have new dollars in their hands that they're going to spend locally. So those 189 jobs generate another 125 jobs by virtue of increasing the overall economic activity in the metropolitan area. Retailers have got to open up another store or add another shift. Some of that, most of that is the retail and wholesale trade, because you have to create some method for delivering those goods. You also have, that means more people are going to end up going to the doctor or having a checkup or getting a new shot or whatever. And it certainly means that as these businesses expand, you're going to need more government services out of them. So you get another 26 jobs in the local government. And then that's the total of the first two. That we consider to be 1 year only. So if you build 100 houses every year, you will continue to do this. If you only build houses in 1 year, 100 houses in 1 year, and then you never build another house, then that's all you'll get. You'll get this 1 year impact from the building and from the extra income created by the people that built the house. The ongoing effect, however, you continue to get, because now you have a house, you have somebody living in that house, you have somebody spending their money locally. So this continues year after year. In this case, that house, those 100 households are going to generate enough new economic activity in the community to create another 55 jobs on almost $1 million in extra local taxes. And here I will point out that the real estate taxes on those houses, $4,500 per house, is only about half of that. So once again, this notion that housing pays for itself just by virtue of the real estate taxes is not true, because there are all these other economic activities that ultimately create economic justification for more government services and therefore more government taxes. And so the total ongoing effect is more than twice what you would normally figure from just the real estate taxes. Now, as I mentioned, that you can't leave that there. That's all the new good stuff that goes on, but you have to pay for it. You have to purchase new personnel and the capital for that personnel to work in. So you have fire protection, garbage collection, roads, correctional facilities, new education, a whole raft of services that are normally connected with a new residential community. How do you figure that out? Well, it turns out, once again, your federal dollars do actually do some good. There is a survey called the Local Government Survey. It's done by the Census Bureau. And every 5 years, local governments report to the Census Bureau on everything they collected and everything they spent. Yeah, and it's available to you if you want to look at it. But it's very useful to us because the way this model works is it says, okay, if there are 10,000 houses in that community, and this is how much they're spending on education, then we can tell you how much a single house costs in terms of education. If there are 10,000 houses and they spend this much on police protection, then we can tell you how much it should cost for an additional 100 houses for police protection. So it's much more complicated than that in the actual mechanism, but that's the principle behind it. We simply align what has been the expenditure in this collection of communities for those particular fiscal services, and we apply that to the new range of homes being built. Same thing with, so this is what we come up with. This is for Portland. This is for per house in this case. And you have to remember that one of the reasons the education might not look as big as you would expect is, number one, we take out the percentage of students in the Portland area that go to private schools or are homeschooled, because they don't cost the education system anything. And we add in whatever Oregon pays into the Portland metropolitan area in terms of education support. So that number may look smaller than what you're used to seeing in some of your local budgets, but that's because it's adjusted for those pluses and minuses. And the same thing is true, that's sort of the one unique one where there's a significant amount of state support in most cases, but all of them are adjusted for that. They're also adjusted for the number of people in the house. So for instance, water service is based on the fact, usually based, the more people you live in the house, the more people use water. So we use what's the average number of people in the households that are buying new houses, and use that as the estimate for how much does it cost to provide new water service for those. That also means you have to calculate the capital cost. So that was the ongoing cost. How much does it cost every year for police and fire and roads and road maintenance and teachers and so forth. But you have to start with buildings and police cars and all the capital equipment necessary to begin that as well. So again, another model built straight out of the government census from the Census Bureau over how much capital is in this community necessary to support the current population. So how much more capital will you need to support another 100 houses? These are the kinds of numbers you come up with. You need to start with another $1,400 in other buildings per house. You need to start with another $6,000 per house in schools before you can begin. So the theory behind this is we start with, you got to borrow that much money. You got to upfront borrow that much money for if it's 100 houses or 1,000 houses, and you got to put that capital in place already, and then you got to start paying interest on it. So that's a capital flow right away. Upfront we've got to spend this much money to establish the capital necessary, and then every year after that we have to spend an additional amount of money on the operating costs of it, and then at 10 years we got to reinvest in some of that capital because some of it will have worn out. So we have a 10-year lifespan for the capital, not a complete lifespan, not an elimination, but a regeneration of the capital that needs to be regenerated. So it's nothing at that point, after all those numbers are put together, it's nothing more than a spreadsheet. It's so we have how much additional revenue in taxes and fees come into all the governments as a result of not only the first year effect of construction, but the ongoing effect of continuous occupation of that house, and how much does it cost to borrow and build all of the capital necessary. and then support that capital through operating costs. And so you get these expenses and revenue balances, and you run out to the end of how does that balance out. In Portland's case, partly due to the fact that you have very expensive homes, have a fairly high real estate tax, and you have a fairly high additional impact fees or infrastructure support fees, what you get is it immediately pays for itself. Usually that blue line is below the yellow line for the first couple of years. There's no guarantee. And then when we sell this model to individual local associations or to builders, that's the first point we make, is this is the numbers speak for themselves. Sometimes they don't come out. If you have a really low tax rate, not much impact fee, relatively low incomes living in the houses, you can have a situation where housing never quite pays for itself, and then you really have to judge it based upon, do you want to expand your community or not. In this case, in using all of these assumptions, using that beginning number, using the technology, we come up with, you continually generate more income to local governments, collectively, all the local governments in the metropolitan area, income greater than the cost, and that continues to increase. That is the presentation. It's pure and simple.